everybody, and welcome to the next webinar from NHT and Discovery Education Pathway Programme, Advice for the Current Times. Those of you who were able to join us in the previous call will know that it's with the brilliant Guy Dudley, very experienced head of advice at the NHT, and also lead author and series editor of the Advice Hub within the Pathway Programme. So we're absolutely delighted that you can join us today. I'm sure you had a busy day, another busy day, a few more weeks left, and then hopefully I really very much hope you'll have a well-deserved and relaxing break over the Christmas period. I really hope so. But until then, I'm sure there's still many, many things in your in tray and on your desk requiring your attention. So it's really good to see you. And I hope that this will be a really informative discussion for you. Certainly the last one was, my goodness. We're going to have some really interesting discussions about the current times and some advice for the current times. And much of this advice is taken from the latest newsletter, which Guy has very kindly written for us. It's the second issue now in the Pathway Programme, and it's placed within the Advice Hub, which is such an important part of the Pathway Programme generally, where you can find all the very latest advice in so many different aspects of teaching and leading and so forth, so many different burning issues that I know will be in your in tray, and it's all there. And just as we've now brought out the second issue of the newsletter, we thought now would be a really good time to get its author on the call, to have Guy Dudley with us again, to talk through some of the main issues in that latest newsletter, which we thought we'd share more widely with everyone. And these are some of the topics that we're going to be looking at today. Reasonable adjustments at school, part-time working, school classroom temperatures. As a former primary head teacher myself, on a fairly modest budget, I'm well aware of the controversy that sometimes school classroom temperatures can sometimes cause. It's a really, really important concern at the moment, actually. Home and flexi-schooling, alcohol and drugs, school calendar. So it's all there. We've got lots to discuss. And just as we did before, we will, of course, be referring, I'm sure, to the current times and the current problems and challenges that we're currently, of course, facing through COVID and the pandemic and the restrictions, social distancing and so forth. So we will be looking at those, of course, within that context. And if you have questions relating specifically to any of these topics, can I suggest that you share them with us in the chat stream? Perhaps if you'd like to publish it for everyone to read, those will be coming through to me. And the Q&A, you can always actually click on the question button if you'd prefer. Either way, we'd love to hear your questions about each topic as we go along. So rather than storing them all up at the very end, let's try and take a few questions as we go. So at the end of each little topic, we'll take your questions relating to that particular theme. And any other burning questions that you really need to ask. We will do our absolute best to put them to Guy, and I know Guy will have some very insightful, useful answers for us. So those of you who haven't been on this call before, Guy Dudley, lead author and series editor of the Pathway Advice Hub, and NHT head of advice, of course, known to hundreds or thousands of head teachers, I should say, and leaders, because of his sage advice that he gives on the back phone, as I always call it. So we are so thrilled to be working with Guy within the Pathway Programme. So it only remains really for me to say, welcome, Guy. It's brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much.
For my magic.
It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me again.
Well, it's great to see you, and thanks so much for giving up an hour of your time. It was a very, very useful hour last time, and I know it will be again. So I'm very keen to stop me talking and give you the opportunity to. So why don't we crack on with that first topic that you were keen to look at on reasonable adjustments at school, if that's okay?
That's fine. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew, and hi, everybody. I thought I'd just touch on a few topics this afternoon that are largely arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been around now since March. We're probably quite used to, we've almost forgotten what running a normal school in normal circumstances is like. But some of these issues are now becoming, I know from the NHT helpline, are becoming real issues for people. And they are arising directly out of the COVID-19 crisis. So I thought I'd touch on them now, because if you haven't had one yet, you might well get one in January when people have had time to draw breath, or you may just have them for other reasons. But reasonable adjustments are one of those areas that are a little bit grey, a little bit unknown to a lot of people, but I thought I'd just touch upon them now And as Andrew said, happy to take any questions whatsoever. What I'll do is I'll spend 2 or 3 moments just reflecting on what they are. There is a document that I've prepared that's got the background on this that will be available to all listeners at the end or within 48 hours of this webinar. But reasonable adjustments, the clues in the title really, I've often spoken to head teachers and said, I've been approached to make some reasonable adjustments because someone is presenting with a particular impairment, and it could be physical or mental, and I'm not entirely sure what to do. Well, the clues in the title, the adjustment is effectively any change to working practice that enables that person with the impairment to perform their job as best as they can. Reasonable is as what it does on the tin. It need only be reasonable. If your school can't afford to make that adjustment, then you've got a legitimate grounds to say no and go back and qualify what adjustments can be made. There's a whole list of them that I provided for people. It could be around modifying sickness absence triggers. The key one, the most common one, is tailoring performance objectives to match the capacity of the member of staff. But at the end of the day, it's around modifying duties, workload, working patterns, location or working hours to enable that person to perform their role. It's nothing more complicated than that. You have a duty of care to those members of staff, so you're under an obligation contractually to consider reasonable adjustments when they're made. And if someone has a registered disability or impairment, you have a legal duty to consider those changes. There's a whole range of them, as I said, and I don't really want to go into too many examples now, but effectively, I think a lot of head teachers, a lot of school leaders feel under pressure to make the adjustments if they're requested. That's not the case. You only need to make it if you can argue that it is reasonable to do so. Yeah. And if it's not, go back and have a discussion with that person until an adjustment can be made when it is reasonable to do so. And if you still can't agree, you may ask the GP or the consultant under whose care that person is to make some suggestions, so you could take some clinical advice to effectively put those adjustments in place. They're pretty straightforward to make. If you don't make them, or if you don't make them in a timely manner, there is a danger that you could face a claim of disability discrimination. So it's very clear that you have a duty to do so quickly, but not to be held to ransom by the person, but effectively to consider each request on its merits and apply a reasonable solution. And if in doubt, take some further advice from your HR provider. They should have a list, but as I said, it's all in there. It's all in the advice paper, and it will be on the advice hub as well if you want further details around reasonable adjustments.
And thank you, Guy. And thank you for your question, Kevin Burnett. So do requests for reasonable adjustments have to be made in writing? And equally for your reply to them has to be in writing?
Hi, Kevin. Kevin and I know each other.
Okay.
Hi, Kevin. No, they don't have to be in writing. But if they're not, I would ask them to be put in writing. A simple email will suffice. And it's always good to respond in writing to that person. Some people have certain types of impairment that are progressive, and therefore it's a dynamic impairment. And you'd really want to keep an auditable trail of what's been discussed and agreed at certain dates. But as I said, this doesn't need to be too elaborate. An email between both parties will suffice.
And thank you. And it isn't It isn't the case, is it, Guy? I hope that the current situation, which I'm sure will probably call for many more reasonable adjustments needed to be made, the current situation doesn't trump the normal practice and protocol for, I mean, everything you've just said applies to now as it would have done a year ago, or, subject to legislation changes. Do you see what I mean? So for COVID arrangements, it's not a different case. It's still the same protocol.
Exactly, Andrew. Yeah, it's the same before, it's the same during, and it will be the same after. The reason why I'm raising it here is that people, because of their caring and social responsibility arrangements at home, they may be caring for someone that is clinically vulnerable, or clinically extremely vulnerable, rather, who are at home. And, one of the adjustments you could make is to allow them to work from home for that period of care. And that's why I thought it was important to mention it today, as I think as this is likely to go on, people will become a little cuter about their entitlements, and they are entitled to ask for reasonable adjustments to be made. But the key word is reasonable.
Reasonable.
Absolutely.
On the clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable piece, we had an extensive discussion. Well, you obviously offered the most amazing advice in our discussion in the previous one, and that can be seen if those on the call didn't see it. It was a really, really good discussion, and it began with a long discussion around that, the areas that we just talked about, clinically extremely vulnerable. That can be viewed on the NHT Facebook page, of course, where it's stored. You can watch it on demand if you hadn't seen it. So do you have another question, actually, very briefly, before we move on to the next one?
Yep.
From Elaine. Thank you, Elaine. Do you have any specific advice for CEV teachers who wish to return? Is it recommended? That is just the sort of thing we discussed, actually, isn't it? Do you want to have a quick answer to that one now, Guy? Or
Absolutely. Thanks, Elaine. There are two issues here. The person who is clinically extremely vulnerable is free to return to school. They're not banished from the school setting, whether they're a parent, whether they're a pupil or a member of staff.
Yeah.
The key thing here, and it may be because someone's mental health may be impaired by being at home, for example. It may be that that they're better being mobile in a school environment than rather sitting at home alone or with very little reason to be mobile. The key thing here is that the CEV person does need some clinical advice. So it may be that a doctor could write a letter, or an occupational health consultant could write a simple one-page report to say this person is better suited to being in a school environment despite being in the CEV category. It's a personal choice. At the end of the day, Elaine, the head teacher is ultimately responsible for the health and safety of all those for whom he or she is ultimately responsible. And therefore, the final decision about someone with CEV being allowed into school has to remain with the head teacher. Because ultimately, if that person is CEV, it means that they're more likely to be at risk from contracting coronavirus, and therefore more likely to be an ultimate carrier of the virus, and therefore a spreader of the virus. So I think ultimately it's a personal choice for the person who's impacted and affected, but the decision will always rest with the head teacher. And the reason you need medical evidence or clinical evidence justification is that you can try and then make a case for the head teacher, to the head teacher or school leader, to make that return to work. And in lots of cases, it can be very simply and successfully made.
Thank you, Guy. That's brilliant. Thank you. And just really in the interest of time and all the different topics that we've got, we need to probably crack on. Sarah, or forgive me if it's Sarah, thank you so much for your question on CEV as well. I've taken a quick image of that, and we'll hopefully get to that at the very end of the session if there's time. And if there isn't, my colleague Bobby has very kindly just pop the actual URL for the previous webinar I did with Guy into the chat stream. Click on that and you can watch it on demand. And we really cover CEV in great detail there. But as I say, I've taken a quick shot of it. So hopefully if we lose it, I've still got it on my phone and we'll get to it at the end of the session. Okay, but thank you for that, Sarah. So Guy, part-time working, you wanted to have a quick look at that?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on this because it's a little bit of a grey area. And, I think, again, Andrew, this is arising from COVID-19, where people are making requests to work part-time, possibly for the very first time in their career. So if you if you're a school leader or even someone thinking about it, i.e. applying for part-time working, because you've got additional care responsibilities at home, I thought it was just important to touch on this. And it's a question that we get a lot of right throughout the year at the NEHT. A part-time employee is anyone who isn't full-time. Now, I know that sounds rather sort of churlish, but if someone's a full-time worker on 35 hours, even if someone works 34 and a half hours, they are regarded contractually and legally as part-time workers. And there's legislation that protects part-time workers that's been in place for 20 years, since 2000. And effectively, it states that part-time workers cannot be treated differently. And by differently, I mean more or less favourably, just because they work a different working pattern to their full-time equivalent comparators, i.e. colleagues. It's really important that that's understood. And I thought, I thought I'd just cover an area as well that often comes up, Andrew. It's where a question we get asked is, do people have the right to work part-time? The answer is no, they don't. They have the right to request it. Does the employer have to grant it? The answer is no. They can say no, but what they've got to be able to do is to object. It's called in law an objective justification. They've got to be able, the employer has got to be able to objectively justify why why the employer are making the case that they cannot be working on a part-time basis. And it's not enough to also, I thought I'd just mention this as well, just in case people are interested in recruiting. You can discriminate against people who are applying for jobs at your school. For example, if someone applies and halfway through the process says, I really was attracted by this full-time job, however, I only really want to work 4 days a week, then that employer is under a duty to consider that request reasonably. And they can say no, but they've got to be able to objectively justify why they're saying no. So, it's an interesting area. Full details are given in the paper that I've prepared to support this webinar. But I think it's an area that some school leaders and some members of staff can get a little bit burnt by if they don't follow the proper procedure. There is a proper procedure. It's very straightforward, and you really only get burnt by it if you don't follow it. So follow the procedure and you should be fine. But a lot of requests for part-time working are coming through as people with COVID-19 caring responsibilities recognise that their full-time arrangements aren't sustainable.
No. Gosh, some difficult decisions to be made, but that's really clear guidance. Thank you. And there's more of that sort of advice, I think, within the Pathway Programme itself, within the Advice Hub. You're constantly producing documents and so forth every week.
Absolutely.
In various different areas, and they're all uploaded into the Pathway Hub. But it's lovely to get a nice summary now for everyone on this call. And we're going to be, just in case you're late to this, we're actually going to be accompanying this webinar. Guy's already drafted a really helpful summary, an actual handout, if you like, which will be sent to everybody who's attending this. So if you're very quickly writing some fast and furious notes, don't worry, this has all been written down. Guy's already prepared this in a document. And an extended version of that document is the newsletter, which features within the Pathway Programme Advice Hub. School classroom temperatures, something that's quite close to my heart from experiences I've had as a primary head. Where do you want to go with this, and why did you include it, Guy?
Well, I included it for a very good reason. Lots of the government advice has said that, to keep schools COVID safe, the classrooms need to be well ventilated. And the German school system have got a very sophisticated ventilation school model where they keep windows open every sort of 10 minutes per hour and circulate those windows around the building. So it effectively creates their own sort of air conditioning system. And we've had quite a number of school leaders call us saying, well, if we keep the windows open, that's fine in perhaps the spring and the summer, possibly the autumn, but we are heading now into a pretty cold period. And so that's why this area has been included. And whenever I give presentations to school leaders in person, which I used to do, and maybe in the future, this is always a question I ask because lots of teachers, if they're of a particular age, will remember that there used to be some thresholds for classroom temperatures. And I expect lots of you who were around before 2012 are racking their brains now to sort of try and remember them. It was 18 degrees in the classroom, 21 degrees in areas of the school where there's less than normal activity. So perhaps a sick bay, for example, if a child's in a sick bay, and 15 degrees in areas of higher than normal activity, so the gym. But David Cameron abolished all of those in agreement with the Health and Safety Executive, and there are no enforceable minimum or maximum temperatures any longer. What the law states is that they must be reasonable, this is temperatures, and they must not be excessive. Just another way of making it quite difficult. And I would just say that whilst the 2012 temperature thresholds were abolished, people still refer back to them because they were the last meaningful reference to temperature control. The World Health Organization stipulates 24 degrees as a maximum, but no minimum. And I think those temperatures are still valid today, Andrew. And I think, again, with the current COVID crisis, where schools are being encouraged to keep ventilation dynamic and windows open, there's no harm in sticking to those last meaningful temperatures. So it's 18 in the classroom,
right.
21 in areas of the school where there's lower than normal activity, sick bay, and 15 in the school gym or in areas of the school where there's higher than normal activity. All that's set out in the document, but I thought it was quite interesting to include it now, as we are heading now towards the final weeks of Christmas, and perhaps head teachers feel a little bit under pressure to keep windows open and ventilation going.
It is. It's a difficult area, and it's an area that I know it's quite an emotional area. I get it. It really is. So that's really useful to have that advice. And again, you've extended on that in the accompanying handout to go with this. So there's some written advice to go with this that you've drafted for us. At this halfway point, Guy, I thought if it's okay with you, we'll just pause to take a couple of questions which are not related to previous, but you have said very kindly that you're happy to take any sort of questions. And let's take a couple of questions that we've just had, one from Karen and one from Hilary. Karen, thank you so much for your question. NEU advice is telling pregnant teachers to ask for working from home from the third trimester. What's NH2 view on this? Telling pregnant teachers, it's just disappeared. The question's just disappeared. What a shame. I think you captured that, didn't you? I'm so sorry. It's just literally disappeared. But yeah, what do you think on that? Should we be telling teachers?
We had a good discussion, didn't we, in the last
on the last one? We did.
On this particular matter, and the current guidance is that pregnant women have been put into the clinically vulnerable category as a precaution. Yeah. And for no other reason, but quite rightly so. I personally think that, and our current take on this, the NHT's current take on this, is that until current guidance tells us differently, we should be able to, our advice is to school leaders and all teachers, stick to the current guidance as it stands and until it changes. I know that some listeners who might be members of other organisations will have received a letter over the weekend advising everyone in the clinically, or advocating and supporting that everyone in the clinically vulnerable category, that the current guidelines is saying you should go to school as long as it's COVID-19 secure, should be allowed to work from home and shouldn't be going into school. Our advice is, well, until, and that flies in the face of the national guidance and flies in the face of NHT's guidance. And I think ultimately that's probably a little bit politically charged, that letter. My advice would be, unless there's a very good reason to, and of course pregnancy is a dynamic thing, and I did mention this, I think, in the last session, Andrew, didn't I? I think when a woman is at the early stages, or certainly at the later stages, i.e. any stage where they feel more vulnerable than not, there's no reason why they can't get a letter from their GP or their midwife or their hospital consultant if they're under one, providing some clinical evidence why they should not be coming into school, even though they sit in the clinically vulnerable. Pregnancy is a dynamic process. It's a long process. And therefore, I think women could oscillate along any of those two scales of clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable.
Yeah, that's so true. We've had a similar sort of question, very pertinent to what you were just saying then, actually, from Hilary, if I may, and then we'll crack on with the next topic. Thank you, Hilary, for your question. We have a teacher who is now in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy and has been advised that she should not return to school because of COVID until after the baby is born. However, the medical advisor is refusing to issue a letter to this effect. Are they obliged to do so if they have issued the advice?
So if the medical practitioner is not providing that clinical evidence, I think it's down to managerial discretion at the end of the day. I would say in those circumstances, Hilary, that I think you shouldn't take this decision on your own if you are the school leader or just responsible for making this decision. I think you should take it with HR's advice, because I think whenever school leaders take decisions on their own, they are effectively accepting all accountability for that decision. And my role as a union official and a supporter of school leaders is that puts you in a vulnerable position. So I think if you haven't got the clinical evidence, talk to your HR provider, because they may be the HR providers to other schools where the same has happened. And what we're trying to get here is consistency and good practice and a good solid argument for you and the school to stand by.
Okay, yeah, that's really clear. Thank you. A couple more questions coming in, but I've taken a quick clip of those, so hopefully we'll store some time at the end. Please do stay on the line. An interesting question around singing, actually, which we're going to come on to. Let's have a look at home and flexi-schooling, Guy. You were keen to build in some time to talk about that, weren't you?
Yes, and really I just wanted to touch on this, Andrew, because we're getting an increasing number of calls at the NHT about requests for parents to homeschool their children. I think the first point I'd like to make is parents do have the right to homeschool their children. And there are some benefits to homeschooling. And parents will give all sorts of reasons for this. But often school leaders are resistant to that because they've worked hard to overcome those issues that have created the request to homeschool in the first place. And schools and school leaders are often seen as complicit in the removal of that child. And in fact, those of you who watched Educating Manchester recently and have read a recent study by Ofsted and YouGov, both of which reports are in the document I've prepared, have said that homeschooling is often confused with off-rolling, which is a very dangerous position to take. But I think ultimately, where you do get a request from the parent to homeschool, and there are lots of these requests. And to answer your question, Andrew, why have I brought this in? There are more cases or more requests to homeschool this year than any other year since World War II because of COVID and the parents' natural parental concern to protect their children. And they think that the children are safer at home. That's not necessarily the best reason to homeschool. It may be because they feel the child's being bullied, that the child's needs aren't being met, they don't agree with the national curriculum, or they want to take their child out before their child might be excluded. There's a whole range of good reasons, but I think the important thing is understand that parents do have the right to ask for it, and schools can't really decline in those circumstances, but what they really want to do is to protect themselves and really have a meeting with the parent and record the reasons why that child is being homeschooled, because then you will avoid any challenge of off-rolling. And that's what I wanted to make this point.
Yeah, it would be cruel in the extreme if it was interpreted as off-rolling, seen as off-rolling.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very simple to get involved in that. Before we come on to alcohol and drugs, it was not that bad. Before we come on to that, shall we just pause for a couple more?
Absolutely, yeah. No
questions that I'm throwing at you, Guy, and you always throw them back. We've had. I tell you what. Before we get on to Elaine's, thank you for your question, Elaine. I had promised that I would go back and look at a previous question, which I'm going to do, which I think was from Kerry. Is it important to note a shorter review date, as some reasonable adjustments may only be temporary, particularly as government guidance around COVID changes and tiers are being reviewed fortnightly? So is it important to note a shorter review date for reasonable adjustments due to COVID?
Yes. I mean, reasonable adjustments but there's no necessarily duration to them. They could be for a week, a month, whatever. Often the nature of them is relatively short-term by definition, because someone's impairment might be temporary. It might be a broken limb, for example. So until that limb gets better, you might want to put some temporary arrangements in. Where I think they last longer than a term, then I think you're into an area where you're more likely to need to be informed by clinical evidence and clinical backing and support, because the very nature of reasonable adjustments, they generally tend to be temporary in nature. If, for example, someone becomes permanently disabled, and there are some cases of that in school life, where someone has been able-bodied one day and permanently disabled, you're not really into reasonable adjustment. You're into a completely different change of working arrangement altogether. Reasonable adjustments need to be, by their very nature, fixed to a sort of reasonable duration. And again, it goes back to that word reasonable. Is it reasonable that you put an adjustment in for 2 years? No, it's probably not. Is it reasonable you put them in for days or weeks or perhaps even a few months? Yes, it is. But I think if the duration of having to make a reasonable adjustment goes on beyond, I'd say, a school term, 12 weeks-ish, then I would argue that you're into a more permanent conversation about a whole completely change of different working arrangements rather than making something that is reasonable and by its definition short-term.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Couple of quick ones then before we move on to the next topic, if that's okay. Thank you so much. If you need to pause for a drink or anything, please do, or even a breath. Couple of really interesting ones from Sarah Morton. Let's take both of Sarah's. And the first one was I did refer to a little earlier, which I promised to ask, which is it's to do with CEV. So what happens if the CEV staff member is unable to work from home due to their job role? How long does this continue for? We're having to cover the role at a cost to other staff and finances. That's an interesting one. So it cannot be done from home. How do we resolve that?
So the new national guidelines came in on the 5th of November, said that CEV people, category people, cannot and should not come into work. But absolutely, Sarah, there are going to be cases where you just think, well, the nature of that nature of that person's work, frankly, can't be done from home. I would sort of just start from that point and say, just be absolutely persuaded that it can't be done from home. So, for example, if they're a classroom teacher, could they deliver lessons online? Although lessons don't need to be delivered online at all, they don't have to be dynamic or live lessons. Could they prepare lessons for others to do? Is there a project that you could give them, whether it be a school improvement project, writing school policies, updating the website, which schools have to do from September in the autumn term? So I think what you're looking to do is provide some suitable alternative duties for that person. Now, you might be saying, and I can't hear you, but you might be saying in your head, that's all very well, Guy, but I haven't got anything suitable and alternative to provide for her. I think you've got two options. Either you just accept that actually she cannot come into work and clock it up as a COVID-related cost in the hope that the government will come back and provide that particular funding, or I would speak to a neighbouring school or even your HR provider who may be able to sort of widen the net in terms of finding that suitable alternative employment. And just finally, Andrew, I'd just say being in a CV category doesn't make you unfit to work. It just makes you extremely vulnerable to contracting the virus. So if you're at home, you're safe, you negate that CV status. And all I would say is, I think the key words here are suitable alternative employment. And I say those because it's a legal definition when someone's made redundant. And in a sense, what you're saying is this person is redundant from, the school is making a case that this person can't do their job. So effectively, they're temporarily redundant. I need to redeploy them to another post that they can do from home, or I need to find some sort of suitable alternative employment. And that's the legal expression for finding someone else work to do in their absence. Hope that helps.
Yeah, in this interesting case, the person Sarah's referring to is a cleaner / site supervisor.
Right.
So, it's an interesting one, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, the advice still stands, isn't it? What you just explained.
It is.
So many different dimensions to this, aren't there? So many different dimensions.
I think the worst possible example you could have given me, Andrew, was a cleaner.
I know. Just thinking that.
Well, I know you didn't give it to me, Sarah. You gave it to me. I think in those circumstances, I think it's very difficult. There is probably no suitable alternative work that they can do. But equally, we just have to clock that one up and try and record it so that we can make claims back for the funding that was COVID related and directly related to excessive budget spend.
Shall we have a quick look at that? Thank you, Guy. We'll have a quick look at that other question, which was any clear advice on singing in primary schools? Sarah's had differing guidance from LCC, our Director of Public Health, and others. So local county council said one thing, Director of Public Health has said another, and others have said something else. What do we think, Guy? We must have singing.
Well, I saw a question on this about sort of 3-4 months ago, and I thought I misread the email, and I thought it said signing, but it did actually say singing. And of course, children, when they do sing, the argument goes, and I expect the question agrees with me, that children can often be a little inelegant when they're singing, and their spit goes places, and they sing to each other's faces, and I think there needs to be a reasonable approach to this. I think if singing can be done in a safe way, I think it should be able to. I mean, it's like any activity, isn't it? I mean, playing. I think that the trouble is with singing, you're engaged in an activity which is more likely to lead to spit and bodily fluids sort of leaving the body, and touching, unnecessary touching. So I think if it can be avoided, it probably is best avoided. However, if I know singing for some schools is really important, and I think it's important for a child's development as well. I think if you can do it safely, then you should. There's no silver bullet to this one, unfortunately, which is why often you'll get conflicting advice. But I think you've got to apply the law of reasonableness in this, and I think if you can space the children out a bit, get them all facing in the same direction so they're not facing one another, then I think you're perfectly safe to do so.
Absolutely. Gosh. Shall we have a look at alcohol and drugs then, Guy? Because you were very keen to include this on this issue. What's on your mind there particularly?
I won't take that personally, Andrew. We're coming up to a season where people will indulge, and I think also there's never a good or a bad time to raise this. I just think it's as good a time to raise it as any. There's full details in the paper I've written. I think it's one of the most difficult things to deal with.
It is.
From a school leadership. Acute safeguarding cases, acts of violence, and alcohol and drugs are things that school teachers, school leaders, aren't equipped for, or most of them won't be equipped for, and it's virgin territory for them. So I think it's really important that they perhaps get hold of this document, have a quick read through. It's only a few pages, but I think the points I wanted to make, Andrew, and again, it's in this lead up to Christmas where people can often indulge and socialise. This year, I guess, is going to be a bit different because families are going to be restricted to a 3-family bubble, aren't they, over the 5 days of Christmas? But I thought it was important that people, listeners to this call, understood that there is no legal requirement to have a drugs and alcohol policy in your school. Employment law protection for both parties requires schools to treat alcohol or drug dependence as a form of sickness rather than a cause for dismissal, on the belief or in the belief that employees can overcome their problem. That's not to say that people cannot be dismissed for abusing alcohol and drug dependence. I think it's also important to just sort of point out that one final thing from me, Andrew, on this is some of the worst calls I've taken is where there's someone intoxicated on the school premises, and someone who may be drug or alcohol dependent may often spend the day functioning quite well, but towards the end of the day, they're a little bit worse for wear. So I thought I'd just share this with people because it's one of those incidents where you think, right, a member of staff who is, I'd call them intoxicated, and they're a risk to themselves and others. What should I do? Well, the bottom line is that 2 members of the school's SLT should get that employee to a safe location on the school premises and stay with them until they decide what to do next. That's sort of step 1. Step 2 is that they should make sure that someone is at that employee's home. I'm assuming it's an employee rather than a pupil, and that there's a responsible adult there ready to be able to care for that person. You might want to consider, as the 3rd step, suspending them on medical grounds. So you're not suspending them on any other grounds than medical grounds until you can get to the bottom of their issues. And of course, if they are, I'll just say use plain language that we all understand, if they are really kicking off and threatening violence or violent, you just call the police. It's as simple as that. But if it can be contained, it's containment, transfer home with the responsible adult, and consider suspension on medical grounds. And then you approach the whole alcohol and drug dependency as a sickness. And because the employer's got a duty, Andrew, to get better. They have a duty to keep well. But that's trumped by the school leader's duty, which is to keep the school a healthy and safe place to be. So that's why they can actually have that decision to suspend on medical grounds. So anyway, I've written all of this in the paper that you've already referred to, but as I said, there's never a good or bad time to raise this, but I thought I'd raise it at a time when it's more likely to raise its ugly head. And I think it's really important that people have a sense of, actually, there is a proper protocol to follow, and if I follow that protocol, I should be okay, and I should feel confident dealing with it.
Absolutely, without putting yourself in danger. In the advice hub, the actual advice hub of the Pathway Programme, you've written a piece on the legal provisions relating to alcohol and drugs. It's a document that you've uploaded onto the programme, which is fascinating, and excerpts from that you kindly included in the free handout to go with this webinar, haven't you? So
I have, and it is one of those areas, Andrew, where you don't know you've got a problem until you've got it.
I know, and then you've really got a problem sometimes to deal with. Yeah,
absolutely. You think someone's perfectly okay and well and functioning well, and then all of a sudden they present with issues that you suddenly think, I've never had to deal with this before, and I don't know how to deal with it. Well, have a read of the document, and I think you'll feel 100% confident and secure in knowing what to do and how to do it.
Brilliant. As ever, brilliant. Let's have a look at the final topic, if we may, Guy, which is school calendar. And then we've got 2 or 3 more questions stacking up. So let's have a look at school calendar first, then, if that's okay.
Well, not surprisingly, one of the questions we've been asked very, very recently is, can we close the school early or earlier than we were scheduled to close it and bring the Christmas break forward? Right. And I can hear the ears pricking up on the other lines. Well, the government guidance is that schools won't close before their scheduled closure dates. And the NHT are supporting that guidance. Yeah. However, some schools have made the decision and have gone public on that decision to close their school early. And in those cases, they are coming under considerable pressure from the regional schools commissioners, right, who are effectively the DfE's sort of watchdog, to revise the decision because they're likely to be challenged by the DfE. So all I would say to listeners is, you can, but it goes against government guidance, and don't be surprised if you suddenly get challenged and rebuffed by the regional schools commissioner, who obviously sort of in bed with Ofsted. So we need to just be clear that this may not be a great record of achievement. Some schools are saying that it's to give people a rest. Yeah. Now, we all need a rest. I'm not denying that. Cool. But that may not be a great enough reason to justify objectively closing the school a week early.
Yeah, I have heard of that. I did wonder. Yeah.
Yes, and we really don't know, Andrew, which is why we're advising stick to the guidance for the moment. We really don't know what appetite the regional schools commissioners have got, whether they are going to bite or whether they're just flexing their muscles. But our job is to protect members and to develop members, and one way of doing that is not advising them necessarily to go against government advice, especially on issues where there's grey either side of the argument. It's not black and white.
I suppose part of the frustration, perhaps, Guy, is that, and again, we've never vowed this to one another, but I'm sure we've never really wanted to make these webinars particularly political. But no. I can't resist saying that, of course, the problem with that, I suppose, is that quite often the government advice changes rather quickly.
It does. And, the NHT advice would be consistent with the government's. I mean, at the moment, we're just saying, look, at the moment, the government advice is saying don't close. and therefore we're also advocating don't close. But they might change their minds, and that's why they were evaluating the appetite amongst schools across the country. But
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I would just say, look, let's pick our battles.
Yeah,
whether they're political or not, let's pick them. And this is probably not one to pick at this stage, especially as if the guidance may well change before Christmas, and schools may be able to decide. Therefore, you've picked a battle that your card might have been marked in the meantime.
I know. Yeah, absolutely right.
I was also just going to sort of mention a couple of other things.
Please do. Yeah.
That is important to mention in the very brief time we've got left, but I want to leave some time for some questions. Again, this is in that document, but I would just say a gentle reminder to people for all their performance reviews, whatever grade you are in a school, have to be completed, generally speaking, by the 31st of December. Which means for schools, that's really at the beginning of December because of all the activities going on in December. I'm sure almost all of them are done, but it's really just a reminder to people to make sure that those are in. If you do want to close, sorry, going back to that, Andrew, if listeners are thinking, well, we do want to close a couple of days early, you could use inset days. Hopefully you won't have used too many of them. You could potentially use inset days to do that, but obviously you'd need to let parents know so that they were on side.
There was an interesting point from Zoe on that, actually, coming at it from a slightly different angle. Thank you, Zoe. Linked with closing early before Christmas, I would love to have a week of remote learning following the Christmas free-for-all and return to on-site learning in the second week of term in January. Just a thought to help stop any infection transmission. I can see your logic there, Zoe. I really can have that buffer, that little hiatus. But again, your advice is going to be the same. Unless you can use them as inset days, stick with the government advice, which is not to come back later, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would advocate using inset days. That's what they're there for. They're there for professional development. Yeah. They're there to sort of self-reflection, and what better way to it's win-win, isn't it? You're giving everyone a bit of a break from giving schools a bit of a circuit breaker.
Well, it's effectively, yeah.
So we would advocate the use of inset days, which is for that purpose. Just a couple of other things very quickly, Andrew. I would just sort of say, website. There's a new guidance coming out that's been rather delayed because of COVID on school websites.
Yep.
There's new rules for academies and maintained schools.
Yep.
They came into force in September, but schools have got the autumn term to implement them. I shall be putting those on the Advice Hub shortly, probably in the next week or so. But have a look at that. It's something that, with Ofsted not sort of looking at resuming their inspections until next year, it's not a crisis. But again, one of those jobs that you might want to give to someone who's at home, who isn't not in the necessarily the example we've discussed, right. But actually updating the school website might be something that you might want to give someone as a project in lieu of being in the school. Yeah, no, that's exactly the sort of thing that perhaps one might be able to catch up on. Absolutely. Other than that, I would just say it's business as usual. And, the rest of the details, the census has gone for the autumn term. So that's a critical date. That's always the one I keep talking about because I used to forget. Forget about that. And also, I would say if you can, final note from me, if you can, well, actually not if you can, you should make some time in your schedule just to make sure that the single central record is as up to date as it can be. It's the one document in a school that can come back and bite head teachers and anybody actually, DSLs, safeguarding leads. It's the one document where, Ofsted will have a look at, and if it's not up to date, they won't be pleased. So an appeal from me to any listener, please make a note in your diary between now and when you close for Christmas to just have a quick look at your single central record and just reassure yourself it's up to date.
I remember, Guy, when I was doing the SCR at the previous school, we had, and I'm sure people on the call will have are already way ahead of me on this, and they'll probably think I'm rather antiquated, but we had all of our members of staff in all the different areas and fields, voluntary, full-time, part-time, everybody, governors, everybody, all on the same huge sheet, which meant that we had many, many empty shaded columns, because some of those columns didn't relate to certain fields of staff. When we shifted from that and putting them all the different categories into different tabs on an Excel spreadsheet, it meant that each tab could be tailored to that particular category of staff, if that made sense. I know that sounds blindingly obvious, but tell you what, we weren't doing that. And when we did that, oh, it was terrific. It meant we didn't have those things that no head teacher likes, which is an empty column. You don't like an empty column. You need to fill it with something. Does that make sense? Just a little thing like that. It would have so much easier for me when we had different tabs.
Yeah, absolutely. It shouldn't be underestimated, that document. It's often what trips things up. So just an appeal from me. Absolutely, fire away.
We're not going to let you go yet. Not going to let you go yet. Your friend Kevin's been on the call anyway again. So and we'll come back to a few others as well. On performance reviews, we haven't discussed performance reviews this time, have we? Should governors pay committee request evidence from a head teacher other than verbal discussion to ratify the head teacher's decision? If they do, can the head teacher refuse? Do governors have the final say on staff pay other than the head teacher, or does it rest with the head teacher? Well, do you want that again?
No, I've got it, I think. The head teacher... the head teacher is effectively making a pay recommendation to the pay committee. Right. And therefore they should support that recommendation with an auditable trail of paperwork. Now, that could be the performance review itself, or it could be a summary report. It hasn't got to be a hugely long, elongated, eloquent document, but there does need to be something in writing. I can't imagine a member of a pay committee, and they tend to be tough nuts to crack, agreeing to something on a whim. And in law, it would be called whimsical. It's a sort of fairly whimsical approval. I think, they need something in writing. The head teacher is making a pay recommendation to the pay committee, and the pay committee have the final say. So it really is the more information and the more written information the head teacher can provide to the pay committee, the more auditable it is, the more accountable they are, and the more likely, more importantly, they are to make a decision in that person's favour. Absolutely. And it doesn't, just to underline, Andrew, it doesn't have to be too elegant. It's a short summary document, a couple of paragraphs would suffice. So just to really try and cram a couple more in before we, those who have to drop off now, we're literally only going to stay for a couple more minutes. Those who do have to drop off now, I just wanted to make you aware, you can relax and enjoy your Christmas, because you're going to get another session with Guy on the 19th of Jan. I'm going to be advertising it properly at the end, but if you have to run now, 19th of Jan, and also on the 10th of December, next week, we've got a brilliant session on pupil premium and disadvantaged provision, particularly during and post-COVID, with the brilliant Dan Jones, Matt's CEO and head teacher. I'll come on to that in a moment, but just so that we can say we've done all the questions, Guy, and I know you'll want to have done. Another one from Kevin. At this difficult time, parents may also find themselves turning to drink or drugs. Have you included guidance on steps to take if you feel a parent shouldn't take charge of their child? Gosh, that's a tricky one, isn't it? It is. Well, I think we're sort of, clearly straying into safeguarding territory. Yeah, aren't we? I think, yeah. And I think, the DSL, the designated safeguarding lead for the school, should be at this time of year on high alert. Yeah. And often it's not just the DSL, it's often the head teacher and 3 or 4 others in a school. If it's a medium to large school, there are often teams of DSLs. But I think, to answer your question, Kevin, I think this is really a matter for the safeguarding team And if the safeguarding team have a concern, they should then refer it to the LADO, the local authority designated officer, so that they can try and establish whether there's any threshold for intervention from that point. But I think it's really a case of being on high alert at the school gate. If you've got a concern, then I think the DSL should be at the school gate at the beginning, at the end of the day, so that they can witness for themselves any evidence of parental misconduct or overall concern.
Yeah, and then seek advice, because you're not alone. Yeah. The final one we'll give to Hazel. Thank you for your patience, Hazel. I think you asked a question a little while ago, so I'm sorry to just come to it now. If a parent has a valid reason for flexi-schooling, does this mean that the school applied to for a place does need to accept a child who will be in school weekly part-time, say 3 days in school and 2 days taught at home? If it's a valid reason for schooling, do you need to accept the child?
Okay, so just so that I'm clear, flexi-schooling is effectively where you have a hybrid of homeschooling and schooling at the school establishment. And the question is whether or not, if that request is made, does the school have to effectively accept it? That's my understanding of
that's how I read it. Yeah.
I think where there is a valid reason to do so, and those reasons I've touched upon in the homeschooling article. So, for example, if the parent is really worried that the child is likely to face exclusion, and therefore a period of flexi-schooling would be adequate for them. If the parent doesn't like the national curriculum or what they're being taught, if they're being bullied, I think the school has to effectively validate the reasons for the application for flexi-schooling and look at the evidence. Is there any rational evidence to support the application for that child to be flexi-schooled? And if there is, and you'd hope that the school and the parent would have the best interests of the school at heart, then there's no reason not to accept it and welcome it and embrace it. But again, it's down to this validation of why they're asking for it in the first place, because it may be that the best place for the child is to be at school or is to be at home, or combinations of the two. But I think it's validation of that reason, of the reasoning.
And as a head, when I encountered a couple of those situations, I was always quite adamant that there was an end goal and an end date. It wasn't something that drifted on. It was an absolute agreed temporary position, wasn't it? With the shared aim to be getting the child back into school as early as possible.
Absolutely. And I think it just finally from me, Andrew, I think it's about keeping that end game in place. What's the objective? Right. Because in a sense, if you know why they're asking and what the objective is, I think the flexible arrangements should actually be quite self-explanatory. And like all things, and I know that I sound like a crap record, but get it in writing, put it in writing, get it signed and dated so that you've got something to come back to and rely on if you're challenged in the future.
Brilliant. Whew. I'm tired. I don't know how you must feel, but again, so important, and lots of appreciation in the chat stream. Thank you so much, Guy, for your help yet again. You've been churning out some amazing documents on the Advice Hub, which I have the good fortune to look at and then upload them onto the platform itself, on the Pathway platform. And they're all really little pearls of wisdom. They really are. So thank you for this bumper pack today. And the handout is going to accompany this, isn't it? And we're going to see you on the 19th of Jan, if not before, for another session where we'll be looking at advice for the current times, whatever that will be.
Who knows? Who knows? But
you do, and you'll know. We look to you for the answers every time, and we're never disappointed. So if that's okay with you, I'm really happy with that. Anything else you wanted to say, Guy?
No, really, just to say, thanks for attending, everybody. I hope you have a lovely Christmas. More importantly, get some really well-deserved rest.
Oh, amen.
Everyone deserves it more than you as public servants doing the job that you do. And I look forward to catching up with you in January.
Brilliant.
So thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you so much for joining us.
All the best.